They came for him just before dawn, when Harlem still held its breath, when the streets were quiet enough for a man to hear his own thoughts. 12 men, 12 professionals, each one paid to end a legend who had already survived more funerals than most men attend in a lifetime. Bumpy Johnson stood at the window of his brownstone on 128th Street, the city's low hum rising through the glass. He didn't flinch when the first car rolled past too slowly. He didn't move when a second followed. He had lived long enough to recognize the shape of death when it circled. The mistake wasn't that they came for him. The mistake was believing he could be taken without consequence. By the time the sun rose over Harlem, 11 men would be dead or dying, and only one would walk away, carrying a story that would stain his sleep for the rest of his life. But to understand how 12 hitmen were foolish enough to believe they could erase Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, you had to understand what Harlem was in those years and what Bumpy Johnson had become to it. Long before that morning, before the guns were loaded and the money exchanged, Harlem was a city within a city. In the 1930s and 40s, it was crowded, hungry, electric with ambition and rage. Black men built lives in a world designed to deny them one. Police protection was selective. Justice was negotiable. Respect had to be enforced, and Bumpy Johnson enforced it. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't posture. He didn't threaten unnecessarily. His power came from something far more dangerous: certainty. When Bumpy spoke, men listened because history had taught them to. He had grown up on these streets, sharp-minded, well-read, with a temper that stayed leashed until it didn't. Harlem remembered the first time he had pushed back against white mob control, not with chaos, but with calculation. He negotiated when others begged. He retaliated when others folded. And when the Italian families realized Harlem wasn't a territory they could simply collect from, they learned his name: Bumpy Johnson. He dressed clean, spoke deliberately, quoted Shakespeare one moment and street arithmetic the next. He could sit across from a crime boss or a politician and make them both uneasy without raising his voice. That was his gift and his warning. By the time the war years came, Bumpy had become more than a numbers kingpin or an enforcer. He was an institution. People came to him when the police wouldn't listen, when landlords exploited, when violence threatened to spill into chaos. He paid school fees. He covered rent. He punished those who preyed on his own. Harlem didn't call him a saint. They called him necessary. And necessity in a city like New York attracts enemies. The contract that put 12 men on the street that morning didn't come from Harlem. It came from outside, from men who had grown tired of negotiating, tired of sharing, tired of a black man who refused to remember his place. The Italians had tried diplomacy. They'd tried pressure. They'd tried to isolate him financially. Every move had been answered, quietly but decisively. Bumpy never embarrassed them publicly. He never overreached. He simply refused to be diminished. That kind of resistance made powerful men nervous. So they did what nervous men always do. They tried to erase the problem. The hitmen weren't amateurs. They came from different crews, different boroughs. Some had killed before. All had been assured this would be clean, fast. 1 man against 12. A message, not a war. They didn't know Harlem. They didn't know Bumpy Johnson. And they didn't understand that by the time a contract reaches men like them, the legend has already heard about it. Bumpy had known for days. Word traveled differently in Harlem. It moved through barbershops and back rooms, through shoeshine stands and stoops. Someone always talked. Someone always owed him. And when the whisper reached him, Bumpy didn't panic. He prepared. He changed his routines just enough to look careless. He let the watchers watch. He let the rumor grow that he'd grown complacent. He wanted them confident. He wanted them close. Because Bumpy Johnson had never believed in running from storms. He believed in standing where the lightning struck hardest and surviving. That morning, as the first light crept over the rooftops, Bumpy adjusted his tie and checked his reflection. Calm, centered, a man at home in his territory. Down below, engines idled, doors opened softly, shoes met pavement. 12 men took positions they believed were hidden. They didn't see the other eyes watching. They didn't notice the subtle movements in windows and doorways. Harlem was awake now, and Harlem knew what this was. This wasn't just an attempt on one man. This was a challenge to the balance that kept the streets from burning. Bumpy stepped away from the window and reached for his coat. He didn't carry fear with him when he walked out that door. He carried history. And somewhere in the shadows, one of the 12 felt it, a tightening in his chest, a sense that something was wrong, that this wasn't an ambush, that this was a reckoning. The first shot was never meant to miss. It cracked through the morning air like a signal flare, sharp and unmistakable, a warning wrapped in lead. The hitman who fired it had been told the same thing the others were told, that once the noise started, Bumpy Johnson would panic, that he'd run, that fear would do the rest. Instead, the door of the brownstone opened. Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the stoop like a man answering a dinner invitation. The street froze. For half a second, no one moved. 12 men, guns drawn in different directions, suddenly uncertain of the script they'd rehearsed. This wasn't how it was supposed to look. Targets didn't walk into gunfire. Legends weren't supposed to be real. Bumpy adjusted his coat and looked down the block, eyes scanning without hurry. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, the word cutting deeper than any insult. "You're early." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. One of the men shifted his weight. Another tightened his grip. The leader, the one promised the biggest cut, stepped forward and sneered. "You Johnson?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Bumpy smiled faintly. "Depends who's asking." That was when the second shot rang out. This one found flesh, but not Bumpy's. The man on the fire escape across the street dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering against iron rails. A third shot followed, then a fourth. From rooftops, from windows, from angles the hitmen hadn't mapped. Harlem answered. The street erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed. Guns swung wildly. Men fired at shadows that fired back with precision. This wasn't a mob scrambling. It was a defense system snapping into place. Bumpy didn't move from the stoop. He stepped back, just enough to let the violence reveal itself. This wasn't about his survival alone. This was about sending a message so clear it would echo through every backroom from Manhattan to Sicily. You do not come into Harlem like this. The hitmen scattered, abandoning formation, discipline replaced by instinct. 2 tried to make for the cars. 1 never reached the door. Another tripped, panicked, and fired blindly, only to be silenced by a single, deliberate shot from across the street. These weren't amateurs dying out there. These were professionals learning the limits of preparation. Bumpy Bumpy finally reached into his coat, not for a gun, but for a cigarette. He lit it slowly, shielded the flame from the wind with his hand. The leaders saw him then, really saw him, in the middle of the storm, untouched. The leader raised his gun and aimed. Click. Empty. The look on his face was something Bumpy recognized immediately, understanding. He didn't plead. He didn't shout. He ran. He made it half a block before a car door slammed shut behind him. He turned and found himself staring down the barrel of a familiar gun, one of Bumpy's men, face expressionless. "Wrong way," the man said. The leader dropped his weapon. By the time the police sirens wailed in the distance, the street had gone eerily quiet. Bodies lay where ambition had put them. Guns rested in gutters. Blood pooled between cracked concrete and broken dreams. 11 men wouldn't leave Harlem alive. One would. The survivor was brought to a basement not far from where it all began. No theatrics, no celebration. Just quiet, controlled aftermath. Bumpy Johnson stood across from him, smoke curling upward, eyes steady. "You know why you're alive?" Bumpy asked. The man swallowed hard. His hands shook despite himself. Because you don't need to kill me." Bumpy nodded. "That's part of it." He leaned closer, not threatening, not kind. "But mostly because I want you to remember." The man looked up, confusion cutting through fear. "Remember what?" he asked. Bumpy's voice dropped. What happens when men mistake patience for weakness? There was no lecture, no drawn-out punishment. Bumpy gave him money, enough to leave the city, enough to start somewhere else. And before the man could thank him, Bumpy raised a finger. "You tell them," he said. "Everyone who thought this was a good idea. You tell them I didn't hide, I didn't run, and I didn't need 12 coffins to make my point." The man nodded furiously. "I'll tell them," he said. "I swear." Bumpy stepped back. "See that you do." By noon, the story had already spread. The police reported a gang-related incident. Newspapers avoided names. Politicians stayed silent. But the underworld understood exactly what had happened. A line had been crossed and redrawn. Italian bosses met behind closed doors, faces tight, voices low. They hadn't expected this scale, this visibility. They hadn't expected Harlem to move as one. And they hadn't expected Bumpy Johnson to stand untouched at the center of it. From that day forward, contracts involving Harlem required more than money. They required permission. And permission was something Bumpy Johnson rarely gave. But the real consequence wasn't the fear, it was the respect. Harlem walked a little taller after that morning. Shopkeepers spoke his name with quiet pride. Mothers told their sons to be smart, to be disciplined, to be like Bumpy, not reckless. He had protected more than himself. He had protected the idea that Harlem could defend its own. And legends like that don't fade. They deepen. The mistake outsiders made was believing the story ended with the bodies on the street. In Harlem, violence was never the final chapter. It was the opening sentence to a longer conversation. One carried out in whispers, stares, and closed-door meetings where power recalibrated itself. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. In the days that followed the failed hit, Harlem settled into a strange calm. Police patrols increased, not to protect the neighborhood, but to observe it. Like men standing near a fire they hadn't started and didn't know how to extinguish. Detectives asked questions they already knew the answers to. No one talked. They never did. Because the people understood something the law didn't. This wasn't chaos. This was correction. Bumpy moved through the neighborhood without ceremony. No victory laps, no speeches. He visited a church on Lenox Avenue, paid for repairs on a building that had taken stray bullets, and made sure the families of innocent bystanders were compensated, quietly, respectfully. That was his real power. Anyone could order killings. Only a few men knew how to restore balance afterward. But outside Harlem, balance was breaking down. The Italian families were furious, not because they had failed, but because they had been embarrassed. 11 dead men drew attention. Attention drew scrutiny, and scrutiny threatened business far beyond Harlem. In a smoke-filled back room in Little Italy, men argued in low, venomous tones. "He made us look weak," one said. "No," another replied. "We made ourselves look stupid." The truth was uncomfortable. They had underestimated him. Worse, they had underestimated what he represented. Killing Bumpy Johnson wouldn't have ended Harlem's resistance. It would have ignited it. And now he had leverage. The survivor delivered his message exactly as instructed. He told them how Bumpy had stood in the open, how Harlem had responded instantly, how the street itself seemed to turn against them. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. By the time he finished, no one doubted the message. Bumpy Johnson was not a problem to be solved. He was a reality to be negotiated with. But negotiation required face, and pride doesn't surrender quietly. A week after the hit attempt, word reached Bumpy that a sit-down was being requested. Neutral ground, trusted intermediaries, old rules. Bumpy listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. "They want peace," his lieutenant said, "on their terms." Bumpy exhaled smoke slowly. "There's no such thing as peace on borrowed terms." Still, he agreed to the meeting. Not because he needed it, because refusing it would have been the only thing that suggested fear. The location was a private dining room in Midtown, far from Harlem, far from Italian neighborhoods. Safe, neutral, supposedly equal. Bumpy arrived alone. That alone unsettled them. The men waiting for him wore tailored suits and practiced expressions. These were men who believed violence was a tool, not a language. They smiled as Bumpy entered, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. One of them stood and offered a hand. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "glad you could make it." Bumpy looked at the hand for a moment, then shook it firmly. "I didn't come to be glad," he said. "I came to be clear." They sat. Wine was poured. Food went untouched. The man at the head of the table cleared his throat. "What happened last week was unfortunate?" Bumpy raised an eyebrow. "That's one word for it." Another man leaned forward. "Mistakes were made." Bumpy nodded. 11 of them. Silence. They hadn't expected humor, certainly not confidence. "We want to move past this," the first man said. "There's no profit in war." Bumpy's voice was steady. "War was your idea. I just declined to die in it." That landed. "You control Harlem," the man said carefully. "We respect that. But there are boundaries." Bumpy leaned back. "Harlem isn't a boundary. It's a community, and it's under my protection." A third man frowned. "Protection comes at a cost." Bumpy smiled thinly. "So does disrespect." The room shifted. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a lesson. "I didn't send men into your neighborhoods," Bumpy continued. "I didn't challenge your authority where you live. You came into my home with guns and assumptions." He leaned forward now, eyes sharp. And you failed. No one interrupted him. From now on, Bumpy said, business in Harlem happens with my knowledge, my approval, or not at all. One of the men bristled. You're asking a lot. Bumpy shook his head. No, I'm allowing you to keep what you have. That was the moment they understood. This wasn't a demand. It was a boundary being drawn by a man who had already proven he could enforce it. After a long pause, the man at the head of the table nodded slowly. Will, consider your terms. Bumpy stood. You'll accept them? He adjusted his coat. Because next time, I won't need Harlem to answer for me. He left without another word. That meeting never appeared in any police report. No transcripts, no witnesses willing to talk. But the effects were immediate. Money flowed differently. Decisions were rerouted. Harlem's autonomy was quietly acknowledged by men who preferred silence over funerals. And Bumpy Johnson returned home. Not as a man who had survived an attack, but as one who had reshaped the balance of power without declaring war. The streets felt it. So did his enemies. But legends aren't measured by how they win battles. They're measured by how few battles they have to fight afterward. Power doesn't announce itself when it's real. It settles in. After the sit-down, Harlem changed in ways only men who lived by the code could recognize. There were fewer outsiders asking the wrong questions, fewer unfamiliar faces lingering too long on corners. Business resumed, but with a new caution, a new awareness of whose shadow covered the streets. Bumpy Johnson didn't tighten his grip. He loosened it. That was the part no one expected. He allowed small disputes to resolve themselves. He let younger men feel responsible for their choices. He watched, listened, corrected quietly when correction was needed. Harlem didn't feel occupied. It felt protected, and that made him more dangerous than ever. But power, especially power earned through restraint, invites one last test. It always does. The challenge didn't come from the Italians this time. It came from inside, men who mistook peace for opportunity. A small crew, ambitious and impatient, began skimming. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to suggest they believed the rules no longer applied. They thought Bumpy was distracted. They were wrong. Bumpy didn't summon them immediately. He waited. He gathered certainty, because punishment without proof was chaos, and chaos was what he'd just prevented. When the time came, he invited them to a back room above a bar on 125th. No guards, no weapons visible, just a table, 3 chairs, and a truth that was about to be spoken out loud. The men arrived confident, joking softly, still believing they were invisible. Bumpy let them talk. Then he slid a ledger across the table. Conversation stopped. "This yours?" he asked one of them. The man hesitated. "Looks like it." Bumpy nodded. "Numbers don't lie. People do." Silence thickened. "You thought because things were quiet," Bumpy continued evenly, "that no one was watching." Another man shifted nervously. "We didn't mean any disrespect." Bumpy looked at him. Intent doesn't change outcome. He stood slowly, hands resting on the table. "I stopped 12 men from turning this place into a graveyard," he said, "not so you could steal from your own." They waited for violence. It didn't come. Instead, Bumpy did something worse. He took everything they had built, control, territory, influence, and reassigned it, publicly, methodically, without shouting, without blood. They were allowed to walk out alive, but stripped. Men like that didn't recover. And everyone watching understood the message. Mercy was not weakness. It was a privilege extended only once. Word of that meeting traveled faster than the gunfire ever had. By the end of the month, Harlem was quieter than it had been in years. Not because people were afraid, but because they understood the boundaries. Police noticed it too. A senior detective, one who had chased Bumpy Johnson for decades without ever catching him cleanly, admitted something to a colleague over coffee. "He's not running Harlem," the detective said. "He's governing it." That was the truth no one wanted to say out loud. Bumpy Johnson had become something the system hadn't planned for, a man outside the law who understood order better than those sworn to uphold it. And yet, the cost of that role weighed on him. Late at night, alone in his study, Bumpy read poetry and philosophy the same way he always had. He understood the contradiction of his life. He lived with it. He didn't justify it. He accepted it, because men like him didn't choose their position. History assigned it. Years later, the lone survivor, the 12th hitman, would be asked about that morning. He was older then, worn down, living far from New York, far from the life that had nearly ended him. He never spoke publicly, but in private, after enough drinks, he told the story the same way every time. "We weren't hunting a man," he'd say. "We walked into a system." He described the calm, the stillness, the feeling that the city itself had turned its face toward them. "And him?" someone would ask. "What was he like?" The survivor would shake his head slowly. "He didn't hate us," he'd say. "That's what scared me most." Because hatred was loud. Bumpy Johnson was quiet. By the time the federal government finally closed in years later, Bumpy's legend was already sealed. Courtrooms couldn't erase what streets remembered. Prison sentences couldn't undo the balance he'd built. Harlem never forgot that morning, not because of the blood, but because of what followed. A community saw what it looked like when someone stood firm without becoming cruel, when power answered violence with structure, when respect was enforced not for ego, but for survival. That was the difference. That was the legend. And legends like that don't die with the man. They live in the rules left behind. Justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a tailored coat, walks calmly through chaos, and leaves order behind without asking for applause. In the months after the failed hit, Harlem entered a rare season of stability. Numbers ran on time. Disputes were settled before they spilled into the streets. Violence didn't disappear, but it stopped being reckless. That alone told everyone who truly held the reins. Bumpy Johnson never claimed credit. He didn't need to. Men knew who had drawn the line. The Italians honored the agreement quietly. No announcements, no ceremonies. Just an absence of interference that spoke louder than any promise. Harlem was no longer treated like open ground. It was acknowledged as sovereign territory, governed by a man who had proven he could defend it without burning it down. For Bumpy, that recognition wasn't personal. It was strategic. Because peace, when earned, creates responsibility, he expanded protections for businesses that had long been preyed upon. He enforced rules that punished exploitation harsher than competition. If someone hurt Harlem for profit, Bumpy made sure profit disappeared. And when the police tried to reclaim authority through pressure, raids, harassment, selective enforcement, Bumpy responded the same way he always had, with patience. He let them exhaust themselves chasing shadows. He instructed his people to stay clean, to give the law nothing it could hold on to. Harlem became harder to justify targeting because, on paper, it was quieter than surrounding neighborhoods. That infuriated the system, because order without permission is still rebellion. A federal task force was assembled quietly, new faces, new tactics. They studied Bumpy the way one studies a general, looking not just at what he did, but at what he prevented. But even they had to admit something unsettling. Crime dropped when he was present. That didn't make him innocent. It made him complicated. Inside Harlem, elders spoke of him with a careful respect. They didn't celebrate the violence of his world, but they acknowledged the protection it brought in a time when no one else offered it. Young men watched him closely. They saw that he didn't boast, that he read more than he spoke, that he never confused fear with loyalty. They learned that power wasn't loud, it was consistent, and above all, they learned restraint. That lesson saved lives. Bumpy knew the streets would outlive him. His concern was always what kind of streets they'd become. That morning, the one with 12 hitmen, became a reference point. Not a brag, a warning. When tempers flared, someone would say, "You trying to bring another morning like that?" And cooler heads prevailed. Because everyone remembered how close Harlem had come to war and how narrowly it had avoided it. The survivor kept his promise. Wherever he went, he told the story carefully, never glamorized it, never exaggerated. He didn't have to. He told them how the plan had unraveled before it began, how confidence dissolved into fear, how the man they came to kill never raised his voice or ran. "He didn't beat us," the survivor would say. "He exposed us." That distinction mattered. Men feared guns. They respected systems, and Bumpy Johnson was a system. Years later, when historians and journalists tried to explain why Harlem avoided the kind of collapse seen elsewhere, they pointed to policies, economics, timing. But people who lived there knew better. They knew it was because once a message had been sent so clearly that no one misunderstood it. You don't walk into a community and expect it to fold. You don't mistake patience for weakness. And you don't come for a legend unless you're prepared to face what stands behind him. Bumpy Johnson didn't live to see every consequence of that morning. No man ever does. But he lived long enough to see something rare. Respect without fear. When he walked down the street, people nodded, not because they were scared, but because they understood what he had preserved. Order, dignity, balance. That was his justice, not perfect, but real. By the time age began to slow his stride, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had nothing left to prove. The streets no longer tested him. They referenced him. Young operators spoke his name like a standard, what to do, what not to do. Older men measured new conflicts against his old decisions. Even those who hated what he represented couldn't deny the stability he had imposed when no one else would. That morning with the 12 hitmen had become fixed in Harlem's memory, not as a tale of violence, but as the moment Harlem realized its power could be organized, disciplined, and defended. It marked the point where fear stopped being reactive and became strategic. Bumpy's influence extended beyond crime. Ministers consulted him quietly when tensions rose. Business owners trusted him more than banks. Mothers who knew exactly what kind of man he was still thanked him for keeping chaos from their doorsteps. He never corrected them. He understood gratitude wasn't his to collect. What mattered was continuity. When federal pressure finally closed in for good, the machinery of the law moved slowly but decisively. Bumpy faced it the same way he faced everything else, upright, informed, unafraid. Prison took his freedom, but it never touched his authority. Even behind bars, disputes were resolved through him. Not by threat, but by trust earned over decades. That's how you know a legend has crossed into something permanent. Long after he was gone, the story of the 12 hitmen still circulated. Not as myth, but as reference. Men argued over details. Numbers changed. Locations blurred. But the core never did. 12 came. 1 left. And Harlem stood. The survivor aged into anonymity, but the memory never loosened its grip. He carried it like a scar, proof that some moments don't end when the shooting stops. They echo. Historians would later write about Bumpy Johnson as a criminal, a racketeer, a kingpin. They weren't wrong, but they weren't complete. Because none of those words explained why an entire neighborhood had responded without being ordered. Why violence had been contained instead of multiplied. Why restraint followed victory. That required a different word. Leadership, not the kind bestowed by elections, the kind forged when systems fail and someone steps into the vacuum with discipline instead of ego. The Italians moved on. So did the police. So did the city. Harlem remained, changed, scarred, stronger, and buried in its collective memory was the understanding that once, just once, a man had drawn a line so clearly that no one ever dared cross it the same way again. That was Bumpy Johnson's legacy. Not fear, not blood, but boundaries. This wasn't just a story about 12 hitmen who failed. It was a story about what happens when power meets preparation and arrogance meets reality. When those men stepped into Harlem before dawn, they believed they were walking into a routine job. Another contract, another body, another neighborhood that would scatter under pressure. What they walked into instead was a community with memory, structure, and a man who understood that respect, once earned, must be defended with clarity, not chaos. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive that morning because he was the fastest gun or the most violent mind. He survived because he had built something deeper than fear. He had built loyalty without illusion, authority without noise, and a system that moved even when he stood still. That's why only one man lived to tell the story. Not as a warning born from cruelty, but as a lesson forged by restraint. Because real legends don't chase dominance, they establish boundaries. And when those boundaries are tested, they respond in a way that makes the test unnecessary ever again. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about survival. It was about dignity, personal and collective. Harlem didn't stand that morning because someone ordered it to. It stood because it knew who had stood for it first. And that is why, decades later, Bumpy Johnson's name still carries weight, not as a myth, not as a fairy tale, but as a reminder. When systems fail, order doesn't always come from authority. Sometimes it comes from a legend who refuses to be erased. Because respect, once earned the hard way, never forgets who defended it.